The postmaster's hands were shaking when he gave it to me. "Letter came in on the stage," he said, "but it's been in the dead mail for, well, a long time. Got stuck behind some parcels. I was cleaning out the back and found it just now." It was addressed to me, Samuel Cross. The handwriting was unmistakable. Eleanor's handwriting. My wife had been dead for 17 years. I stood in that post office, dust motes floating in the afternoon light, and felt the world tilt beneath my feet. The letter was yellowed at the edges, the seal broken as though it had been opened and resealed many times. The postmark was dated 1887. Today was 1904. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single page in her careful script, and words that made no sense at all. "Samuel, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, but you need to know the truth that I died keeping. And you need to know it now, because the time for silence is ended." Behind me, the postmaster cleared his throat nervously. "There's something wrong, Mr. Cross." Everything was wrong. Everything had always been wrong. I just hadn't known it. But before this moment shattered everything, the story goes, let me take you back to where it all began. My name is Samuel Cross. I'm 71 years old, and I've lived in Redemption Creek for 42 years. I came here with Eleanor in 1862. She was my wife, the love of my life, the woman I would have died for. We built a homestead together. We raised 3 children. We buried 2 of them in the cemetery on the hill, along with Eleanor 17 years ago, when she died of pneumonia in the winter of 1887. I've lived quietly since then. My surviving son moved east. I stayed, maintaining the property, working the land, living with the absence of her the way you live with a missing limb. You learn to adapt, but the ghost of it never fully disappears. The morning I received the letter, I was preparing to sell the property. I'm old. There's no reason to keep it. I'd planned to move in with my son's family back east, to spend my final years surrounded by grandchildren I barely know. I was ready to leave the frontier behind. The letter changed everything. I took the letter home and read it by the window where Eleanor used to sit. If you're reading this, it means something happened to me before I could tell you myself, and that breaks my heart in a way I can barely write. Samuel, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for 17 years of silence. I'm sorry for not being brave enough to tell you when I was alive. But the dead don't carry secrets the way the living do. The dead are finally free. My hands were steady as I read, but my mind was fracturing. I didn't die of pneumonia, Eleanor's ghost continued through her own words. Or rather I did, but not the way you think. Samuel, I was poisoned, slowly, deliberately, over months, and I knew who was doing it. I had to sit down. It was your brother Thomas. He came to me in the kitchen when you were out working. He said you'd made a terrible mistake, that you'd promised him money, the money from selling part of our land to the railroad, that you'd promised and then refused to follow through. He said you'd humiliated him in front of the investors. He said the only way to teach you a lesson was to make you suffer the way he was suffering. The words blurred before my eyes. Thomas didn't come to me with violence, Samuel. He came with arsenic, tiny amounts, mixed into my tea, my food. He took his time. He watched me get sick. And I realized what was happening, but I couldn't prove it. Who would believe me? Your brother against my suspicions? And if I told you, you would kill him, and the law would hang you for it. So I stayed silent. I took the poison, and I died, and I made sure it looked like pneumonia. I couldn't breathe. But Samuel, listen, this is important. Thomas kept a journal. He wrote everything down, not because he was evil, but because he was weak. He needed to confess to someone, so he confessed to paper. I found it hidden in the barn. I read every word, and then I hid it again, because I wanted you to find it someday. Not now, while you're young and angry, but someday, when you're old enough to understand why I did this, why I chose silence over revenge. The letter ended with a date, the day before she died. The journal is still in the barn, Samuel, behind the stone wall, third stone from the corner, in the hollow space. I sealed it in canvas and tar. It should have survived. Inside the barn, you'll find Thomas's confession. You'll find the truth. And maybe when you read it, you'll understand that the real poison wasn't the arsenic he gave me. It was the bitterness he carried, the shame he couldn't bear, the envy that ate him alive. Her final words, "I love you. That's why I didn't tell you." Love sometimes means protecting someone from truths that would destroy them. I walked to the barn as the sun was setting. 17 years. I'd been in that barn thousands of times, mended the roof, stored the harvest, worked beside my brother Thomas when he visited back in those early years before he moved to San Francisco, before we lost touch. I counted stones from the corner. Third from the corner. I began to pry at the gap between them, my old hands struggling with the leverage. It took an hour to work it free. The stone came away, and inside was a hollow space, and inside that, a bundle wrapped in canvas so carefully preserved that it had survived 17 years of temperature changes, of moisture and dust and time. My hands were shaking as I unwrapped it. Thomas's journal, his leather-bound journal, filled with entries in handwriting that I recognized immediately, the handwriting of a man confessing. The first entry was dated June 1887. I did it today. I put the arsenic in Eleanor's tea while Samuel was in the fields. Just a small amount. She'll be fine. It's just to teach him a lesson. He needs to understand consequences. He needs to understand that when you make promises to family, you keep them. I read through the pages like a man reading his own death. Thomas had poisoned my wife over months, documenting his actions as though he were conducting an experiment. He wrote about watching her get sick. He wrote about the guilt that gnawed at him. He wrote about how he couldn't stop, that each new dose was an attempt to either end the poisoning or accelerate its effects, and each time he was unable to choose between stopping and finishing what he'd started. The final entry was the day before Eleanor died. She's fading now. I can see it in her eyes. She knows. I think she's known for weeks, and she hasn't told Samuel. She hasn't exposed me. All this time, and she's protected me, and I don't even know why. I'm going to stop. I'm going to leave town. I'm going to go to San Francisco and start a new life and pretend this never happened. But it did happen, and I'll carry it with me forever. And then, nothing. 17 years of silence. Thomas had left town. We'd sent letters back and forth occasionally, awkward and distant. He had died in 1902, never knowing that Eleanor had left a confession, never knowing that I'd know the truth. I sat in that barn with his journal in my hands, and I felt something inside me break, not with rage, but with a terrible understanding. Eleanor had read these same pages. Eleanor knew exactly what Thomas had done, and she'd chosen to let me believe she died of natural causes rather than expose him to my vengeance. I walked to the cemetery as darkness fell. Eleanor's grave was at the top of the hill, looking out over the valley. I'd visited it 1,000 times in 17 years. I'd brought flowers, I'd talked to the stone, I'd wept and raged, and slowly, over time, learned to live with her absence. But I'd never really understood her. I sat on the grass beside the grave and opened the journal again, reading by the light of the rising moon. And with each entry, each confession, each moment of Thomas's internal struggle, I began to see what Eleanor had seen. My brother wasn't evil. He was broken. He was small. He was terrified of his own inadequacy, and his violence came from that terror. And Eleanor, my Eleanor, had understood that. She'd read his words and seen not a monster, but a man undone by his own weakness. And she'd chosen to protect both of us. If she'd told me, I would have killed him. The law would have hanged me. Our son would have grown up without a father. The ranch would have been seized. The pain would have multiplied across generations. Instead, Eleanor had taken the poison. She died quietly. She'd left the truth for me to find only after I was old enough to bear it with something other than violence. That was love. That was the deepest kind of mercy. I wept there in the dark, not from rage or grief, but from the profound understanding that my wife had been braver than I ever knew. She'd sacrificed not just her life, but her silence. She died carrying a secret so that I could live free of the burden of revenge. I burned Thomas's journal the next morning, not out of anger, but out of respect for Eleanor's choice. She'd kept that journal hidden for a reason. She'd wanted me to know the truth, but she also understood that some truths, once public, can't be contained. They poison everything they touch. By burning it, I was honoring her final act, her decision that the past should die with the people who lived it. I sat with the postmaster that afternoon. That letter you gave me, was there anything else? Any note about when it should have arrived? He fought hard. There was a date written on the envelope, 1888, instructions to deliver if Samuel Cross was still in Redemption Creek, but it got lost in the mail, and I just found it now. Eleanor had written it to be delivered a year after her death. She'd planned for me to know relatively soon after losing her, but the Frontier's postal system failed, and 17 years passed instead of one. Maybe that was mercy too. Maybe Eleanor understood that I needed time, years and years of it, before I could read her final letter without rage overtaking me. Maybe the Postal Service did me a kindness by delaying it. I asked the postmaster to help me draft a response, even though there was no one to send it to. Dear Eleanor, I wrote, I found your journal. I read Thomas's confession, and I understand now what you did and why you did it. You chose silence to save me from becoming a killer. You died carrying a secret so that I could live free of the burden of revenge. I burned the letter, the way she burned the poison, carrying it into the world through smoke and memory. I'm staying on the homestead. I canceled my plans to move east. I told my son I'd changed my mind, and he understood. He was his mother's child too, and he recognized the weight that comes with suddenly understanding the sacrifices that made your life possible. I've kept Eleanor's letter. It sits on my desk, and I read it sometimes, not to torture myself, but to remind me what real love looks like. It's not passion. It's not romance. It's someone choosing to die quietly so that you can live free of rage. I planted flowers on Eleanor's grave, her favorites, the ones she used to grow in the garden. I talk to her there sometimes, telling her about my days, about the things I've understood. I tell her that her silence wasn't weakness. It was the strongest thing a person could do. The frontier teaches you many things, but the hardest lesson is this. Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones we never fully know. Sometimes their greatest gifts are the ones we don't understand until after they're gone. And sometimes the deepest honor we can give them is to stop asking questions and simply accept that they did what they did for reasons rooted in a love so profound it sacrificed itself. That's the real frontier story. Not about conflict or conquest, but about the quiet revolutions of mercy that happen in kitchens and barns and cemeteries, where one person chooses to bear a burden so another can live free. Thank you for listening to this tale here on Frontier Love Tales. If this story of a woman's final message, if it reminded you that sometimes love means carrying secrets to the grave, that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we understand last, then make sure you subscribe. Because out here on the frontier, every sunset hides another story waiting to be told. Stories of letters that arrive decades too late. Stories of silences that speak louder than words. Stories about what it means to truly love someone enough to protect them from the truth. Subscribe, because these stories matter.